for our CITP webinar with Peter Foster talking about his new book, What Went Wrong, What Went Wrong with Brexit, and what to do, and what can we do about it. CITP, if you're not familiar with it, we're a relatively new ESRC centre on inclusive trade policy. And we are very keen on making trade policy more inclusive. We've got researchers from law, economics, and politics across the four parts of the UK, but also international partners. And we're really, fascinated by these questions, especially, of course, with the UK having finally, or perhaps finally, the option of developing its own trade policy. So Peter's book is going to help us also think through these last few years of the UK trying to do things on trade, especially with its nearest neighbour, the European Union. So the way we're going to be running the webinar is simple. Peter is going to be speaking for about 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to have a response from Alan Winters. So before I give the floor to both of them, I will introduce them shortly. So Peter Foster, of course, is public policy editor for the Financial Times, was Europe editor for the Telegraph during some of the heydays of the last few years of the UK membership of the European Union and the Brexit negotiations. And Alan Winters is, of course, our co-director for CITP. So, Peter, over to you, and I look forward to our discussions.
Thanks, Vivian, and thanks CITP for doing this event. I thought I would start by addressing the question of why I wrote the book in the first place. Which was, people often used to say to me, you're an Olympic Brexit bore, and yet you've never written a book. Why have you never written a book? And the answer to that question was actually because nobody wanted to publish a book, because between the years of 2017 to 2020, Brexit was either a moving target or it was in a space politically where there was a kind of inertia. And nobody wanted to talk about it because it had been such a psychodrama. And nobody really thought that at any level, whatever you thought about Brexit, anything was going to change. And so when Canongate, the publisher of this book, phoned me up actually in December and said, could you write a book by the 1st of March, or 1st of April, rather, it was because they sensed that there was an opportunity, a moment coming up where the Brexit discussion was potentially about to be reopened. And that was partly about a Labour government being elected. It was partly about the opinion polls changing and the public's attitude to Brexit, the sort of dawning sense that in many senses it wasn't going well, including among 2019 Tory voters. There's some Redfield and Wilton polling which showed that 2019 Tory voters believed that Brexit has made the cost of living worse, made the economy weaker, made trading more difficult. And so you add that together and then you get to the 2026 implementation review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And there was a sense that a space was opening up to talk about Brexit again. And so I think that is probably still correct. We saw Keir Starmer going to The Hague and going to see Macron in Paris, although, in lots of ways you see lots of political pundits saying that Brexit is not going to be an election theme. You're starting to see pressure on the Labour Party to be more clear about where its Brexit policy really is. And we can talk about where it is and where it might go. I think it's still pretty cakeist and muddy in lots of areas, but nonetheless, you saw last week the beginnings of a Brexit debate. The Lib Dem conference that I was at in Bournemouth just gone, the beginnings of a Brexit debate. So I wrote the book because this conversation was restarting, and then it was premised on the idea that if you're going to have a conversation about what to do about Brexit, you do need to have, without getting back into trying to win old arguments, you do need to have a kind of cogent sense of why Brexit has been so challenging. So in the first half of the book, I try and set out in quite a nuts and boltsy, apples and oranges kind of way. It's a journalist book, this. It's not a trade wonks book. And it probably wouldn't tell most of the people on this call anything that they don't know. but what it tries to do is express the actual challenges that come, particularly for small businesses, to trading in the single market once we've essentially done a reverse trade deal with our largest market. And even though that's obvious when you think about it, it's interesting that it's not still, I don't think, an internalized part of the Brexit conversation. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, when he signed this deal in 2020, Christmas Eve 2020, he said that, if anything, my friends, this Brexit deal is going to allow us to do more trade with our friends in Europe, which is clearly nonsense. David Frost gave his speech in Brussels saying he didn't believe, or he believed that non-tariff barriers to trade were exaggerated. There's an enormous amount of evidence post-Brexit that that's not the case. Doing your safety and security declarations, doing your rules of origin, doing your export health certificates has had a serious effect on UK trade with Europe. Shrunk volumes, both in absolute terms, but also in terms of the numbers of relationships that have been lost as a result of Brexit, trading relationships. A lot of them are very small, SMEs and micro businesses, and some which I quote in the book. So Hampstead Teas battling with Italian customs to get their organic probiotic teas in. And what you discover is that leaving the single market means that even though you have exactly the same organic directive that you had pre-Brexit, because it was sucked onto the UK statute book, and it's implemented in exactly the same way, you lose the presumption of compliance. So you still need to show up at the border, the external border of the EU, with a certificate proving that you've complied and the right stickers and all the rest of it. And then you discover that actually the single market isn't quite as single as you might think, because each of the 27 member states interprets and enforces the organics directive, for example, with different levels of alacrity. And so she gets into a long email discussion about whether or not green tea should be treated like black tea, whether it's cut, curled and fermented, etc. And you can just literally feel Britain's small businesses banging their head against the table. So that's the first part, is trying to explain why those trade presses for goods and for services. So I use a company called Infinity Engineering Services that gives up trying to service its gas turbine boilers in the EU because its EU clients don't want to go through the paperwork to get the right visas to get their gas turbine serviced by this company that was a Siemens spin-off that started pre-Brexit and essentially gave up in Europe. So both in terms of mode 4 fly-in, fly-out services, and in terms of moving goods, particularly complex goods over the border, what you start to see is trade relationships falling away. And then also over time, the Resolution Foundation did a very good report on this, UK companies being slowly squeezed out of European high-value supply chains. So a company I talked to in Warwick, for example, that makes those super whizzy machines that fill pipettes in pharma labs. They also make the machines that make Magnum ice creams. But anyway, they serve big pharma post-Brexit, Eli Lilly, Pfizer, Astra, all did investments in Ireland. And this company found itself with its Irish customers phoning it up and saying, look, our American parents are saying, where possible, we are being told to cut the UK out of the supply chain. And as the resolution report points out, what you get, therefore, is not a massive crisis, not a massive unemployment crisis because the UK has tight labour markets everywhere else, but you get the replacement of higher productivity, higher value manufacturing industry with lower productivity, lower paying industry in logistics and other areas. And that, of course, is bad for UK productivity. It's also bad for UK investment. So that's the kind of nuts and boltsy trade piece. The second piece is about what Brexit did to UK politics, the madness of the Johnson and Truss years, and how it corroded the constitutional position of the UK and the relationship between ministers and civil servants, between government and business, and between government and the judiciary, and what that's done to the overall attractiveness of the UK as an investment partner. And I quote a Bank of England paper in there, which looks at how Brexit was not a one-off shock like you see, for example, the oil shock in the 1970s or the 9/11 impacts or the 2008 financial crisis. Brexit is a piece of ongoing uncertainty that's baked in because the UK is, as it were, an iceberg that's carved off the regulatory ice sheet of the European Union, this regulatory behemoth. And the ratchet that is there just by dint even of passive divergence means that over time, the UK is constantly moving away from the EU. And the next piece of that, which again is a bit of Brexit, I think that is still not properly internalized in the Brexit discussion, is that Brexit is an ongoing issue. Brexit 2.0 is what industry calls it. And again, a lot of the Labour understanding of how you fix Brexit kind of misses the fact that what you've got coming down the tracks, carbon border adjustment mechanism, for example, pay transparency directive, supply chain due diligence directive, plastic packaging directive, all of that creates additional and enduring friction for UK businesses trading in the single market. And so it doesn't have to be catastrophic. It's just that perpetual marginal increasing disadvantage that comes from the ratchet. That means it's just cheaper and easier and more reliable to trade at the margin with Pedro in Barcelona than it is with Peter in Brighton. And I think, again, because none of the political parties have really wanted to point the finger at Brexit as the cause of the rising cost of living crisis, as the cause of the travails of the car industry, as the cause of the UK, difficulty in business investment and FDI, you haven't had an environment where you might expect, where a very hard super sovereigntist Tory Brexit is constantly being, pointed out, even though the polls suggest people are kind of getting the message. Actually, you haven't had a world, and I speak as a journalist, where it's very difficult to get Labour politicians to come out and point the finger. Haven't had a world where the run-up to this next political cycle, this next election next year, has been, predicated on the opposition parties consistently pointing out what Brexit has done to UK trading relationships and to the UK vis-a-vis the market on its doorstep, the EU. So I think that's the kind of first half. The second half is then, of course, what do you do about it? And I very deliberately set myself the challenge of writing a prescription for what you do about it within the parameters of both the Labour Party and the Tory Party saying that they don't want to join a customs union with the EU and they don't want to rejoin the EU single market. And so you may read the book and think, well, actually, it's a prescription for softening, pinking those red lines, because it points out that there are really quite limited things that you can do to reduce that marginal frictional disadvantage, which doesn't have to be massive, just to make it more reliable, cheaper and easier, all things being equal, to trade with companies inside the single market than outside them. And so it begs the question whether the Labour Party is being realistic when it says it's going to do a much closer deal with Europe when it's drawn those red lines. So you saw last week probably that there was that clip of Starmer in his conference in Canada saying that the UK didn't want to be unaligned from the EU. And all he was saying was, frankly, what the Tories have said, which is we don't want to race to the bottom on labour market, on labour standards and on environmental standards, etc. Nothing to see there. But the minute Sky News put it up and started kind of turn it into a political fight, the Labour Party, quite interestingly, I think, got quite spooked. And they put out a statement saying, we're not going to be a rule taker with the EU. We don't believe in dynamic alignment. We're not going to do, then they clarified and said, we're not going to do any alignment that doesn't have the approval of Parliament. So that still leaves the door open, for example, to doing a Swiss-style veterinary agreement where you do have dynamic alignment. You would do away with export health certificates. which would cut probably half the cost of the target operating model that's coming in. But that will require you to be a rule taker, and it will also require you to upset bits of the food and drink industry, for example, oat farmers that need a particular type of pesticide that's banned in the EU. And you will find quite quickly two things, I think. One is that the Labour Party are going to have to find courage that they have not so far exhibited in terms of defending a load of rule taking, because we will be a rule taker. We are a rule taker, right? Even this government accepts the CE mark, the validity of the CE mark in the UK, except for medical devices and construction products. But in fact, we are in many areas. It's one of the ironies of Brexit that taking back control has left us, more at the mercy of EU rules just by dint of size. But I think the Labour Party has underestimated the extent to which rule taking will still be a political football, and the extent to which Starmer can shrug that off will, I think, depend on the size of his majority. But the right-wing press, the pro-Brexit press, is still in bendy banana mode. The travails of Brexit doesn't seem to have got them off that. And the Labour Party is not, at the moment, certainly pre-election, prepared to, make the case for alignment. They didn't come out after that confected Sky News story and go, well, yeah, we are going to be aligned because that's what the car industry needs, and that's what the agri-food industry needs. Because, as everybody on this call knows, alignment doesn't get you access, and the alignment will cause you a political penalty, and it won't, in lots of areas, fully remove the disadvantage from being outside the single market. It will make it easier in some areas, but it's not going to macro remove that disadvantage, which is why you might then consider, well, if we're going to do a load of rule taking, do we want to, start to think about how we get a seat at the table? Do we want to actually think about being in a customs union with the EU and a regulatory union to move our way back to the single market? Because, of course, it's not at all clear that the European Union, who aren't holding daily webinars fretting about what Brexit has done to their trade, are really that interested in engaging with the UK. So the second piece of that puzzle about whether or not the UK is going to really be able to engage with the EU is going to be able to take this 2026 review, which is technically an implementation review. And for now, the European Commission is very clear, Stefan Führing, Maros Šefčovič, very clear that it's an implementation review. It's nothing more. Now, I don't necessarily think it has to be only a very technocratic implementation review if you could reframe the discussion politically. So that brings you on to the next piece, which is how does the UK reframe the discussion politically if a Starmer government goes around Europe and makes clear that it doesn't want the kind of adversarial zero-sum relationship that was characterized by the Frost and Johnson, and to a large degree, if you look at, for example, the Horizon negotiation, the Sunak approach to dealing with the EU. How does the British government really reframe that relationship, in a way that pricks European interest, bearing in mind that, we've had 7 years, it will be nearly 10 years of adversarial, abrasive relationships where you look at the British polity and you quite reasonably ask whether actually it's structurally incapable of not having an adversarial relationship with Europe. Because if you can't get over that hump, then why would the EU build new structures, which, it's got other things to worry about? It's got Ukraine, energy security, its own Green Deal, it's got China, strategic autonomy, etc. Why would you engage with the Brits if you fear that actually, the right-wing press, the tabloid press is going to drag the next government back out? The EU, I think, is going to need convincing that the UK is in a position to engage on a serious and structural level. But if you could do that, what would you do in order to, reframe that discussion, in order to take that rule-taking discussion to another level? And I think there are a number of things you could do. The first one is, reactivate that strategic security partnership that Theresa May talked about and Boris Johnson jumped. And there's, evidence that there's things to build on there. There's the North Sea cooperation in renewables cooperation, which is a commission-chaired event. You can build on that. There are geological assets the UK has, for example, on carbon capture and storage. You could link legally the carbon markets of the EU and the UK. Yes, you'd be giving up sovereignty, you'd be giving up control of ETS revenues in lots of ways. You'd be giving up levers of net zero policy. I'm not sure that's as politically easy as some people think it is, but it would be a real signal that you don't want a situation as we have at the moment, where UK carbon is trading at a €50 discount. There are stuff you can do on security. There's the European Peace Facility for funding munitions to Ukraine. You might make a view that you don't want to necessarily stick a Union Jack of ammo that goes to Ukraine. You could do that in a more neighborhood way. There's the rebuilding of Ukraine. There is the Balkans, for example, Operation Althea. There are hooks there where the UK could start to get into the security piece, justice and home affairs, cooperation on data sharing on the criminal and intelligence piece. The Nordics and the Baltics particularly keen on signal intelligence sharing, etc. So that's not a quid pro quo for trade. It never was, and playing that game always fails. But I think that is the beginning of putting a different kind of floor under the relationship. Then I think, if you want to get into the quid pro quos on the trading side, I think there are areas where the UK, without overstating it, has things to offer. For example, on mobility. Now, the Tory government's been going around capitals trying to get mobility deals, a youth mobility deal. You are going to have to be defended against, no doubt, the attacks in the right wing media. It's free movements back through the back door. You've seen all these already betrayal headlines in the Daily Mail just because Starmer went on one trip to Paris. But actually, if you're prepared to make the case, the soft case for Europe, you could do a youth mobility deal. Again, the European Union's rejected, the Commission's advised member states to reject these national individual overtures because it just sees the Tory government essentially taking quite a zero-sum approach. As one senior official said to me, the way we see it, the UK has a labour crunch problem, and it just wants cheap European youngsters to be, labour market fodder without good social security protection for the UK. We don't want to be a source of cheap labour. We've got our own labour market issues. So if we're going to do it, we're going to do it properly. There needs to be social security. We need to talk about the NHS surcharge. And that, of course, is about privileging EU citizens over non-EU citizens, something which the Tory government has been reluctant to do because it's tried to maintain this, basic fiction, in my view, that you treat your neighbourhood the same way as you treat any country from anywhere around the world. But of course, the neighbourhood's not the same as everywhere around the world because they're right next door and they're connected to us by a pipe. And actually, people can come and go much more easily. So you could get into a discussion about mobility. I think there's a big discussion about professional mobility that is a real source of friction for European countries. Erasmus is another place. European elites do want better access to the UK. London is still the most diverse city in Europe in terms of Europeans resident in London. So I think you have to think quite hard about a fundamental reset and then think hard about how you use that, including potentially dynamically aligning in sectors. This is a Tony Blair Institute idea, but using that and segueing out of that initial rule taking, where the Commission no doubt will go, well, that's Fight Club, baby, you're a small country on the periphery of a large bloc, and actually use that to segue into a deeper discussion about, how the UK becomes a regulatory satellite of the EU, part of the wider neighbourhood ambition on net zero, on trade, vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis, United States. And, so much of this depends on where Starmer is in terms of his majority, but also what happens in the US election. If we have a Trump in America, you probably have a very different complexion to the discussion than if you have another Democrat administration. That's how the UK can try and start to make itself more relevant, get back into some of the institutions where it could provide expertise, like the Trade and Technology Council between the US and the EU. Currently, we're despite our best efforts, excluded from that, and start to move the discussion on. It'll be 10 years since the Brexit vote. There'll be a new generation of leaders in the EU. I don't want to overstate how easy it will be. And I think one of the challenges Labour is going to have is that they will suck up political pain for very little apparent immediate gain. But of course, the counter argument is, what do you do alternatively? The relationships that we're trying to save and preserve have a half-life. Another 5 years of inactivity are going to make it harder and harder to repair the damage. The British frog, in terms of investment and productivity, is going to be, continue to be boiled. And therefore, a Labour government, if it wants to be the fastest growing economy in G7, if it wants to attract investment, if it wants to draw a line under the Tory years, is going to have to do some politically courageous and difficult things. I don't know whether or not they have the bandwidth or the appetite to do that, because, and this is the last observation that I will make, the truth is nobody, not Tony Blair even, has really made a positive case for Europe and European engagement for 40 years in this country. And if a Labour Party does that as its way out of the Brexit cul-de-sac, it will be a challenge, and nobody should underestimate how difficult that will be. And I hope that, better judgment prevails in Europe, and that Starmer, a serious Starmer government, can find, and I think, there are indications that it could find, a receptive European audience for these overtures, but it needs to frame them in a non-cherry-pick, realistic sort of way. So, that's what the book says. Oh, and the last thing it says is, and if you can't do any of that, it's still worth being realistic and coming to terms with Brexit, because if you're not going to join the single market and customs union, then at least an honest dialogue with business and with local government and with investors will lead you to the conclusion that you need to do a bunch of things that we've really not done, which is invest in skills, create a pipeline of skills, tackle the NIMBYism that stops planning industrial land being released for planning, and think really hard about what the UK offer is post-Brexit, which right now is still very unclear when you talk to investors. So that's the kind of final get-out argument, is even if all of this is so intractable, we can't do anything about it, well, we better be clear that we've backed ourselves into a pretty nasty little corner, and we better be really gimlet-eyed about what we need to do to create a post-Brexit UK in the world offer.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. Alan, I'm going to be, passing over to you, but first, people in the audience, I see if there's a few questions coming in already. There's a question and answer space for you in the webinar to put in questions, so please do so. And once Alan has talked, I'll be looking through these and asking them of Peter. So please fire over your questions. Over to you, Alan.
Okay, thanks very much, Vivian, and thank you very much to Peter. I mean, thanks for the book, and also thanks for all the journalism. I think many of us who have lived and agonized through Brexit really value the work, the stories that you're digging up, and the analysis. I think the book is really excellent. I mean, starting with the history, in a sense, seems like a sensible place to start, thinking about how do we avoid it, what do we do now. It does make the book truly awful in the correct sense of the term. I mean, it's made me remember and relive these agonies. And I begin to think, perhaps I'm actually been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of it. And you've stirred that pot. So I'm all sort of stirred up. And so let me just go through and sort of highlight one or two of the things that you've said that I suppose in a sense that I agree with, and then come to just a few questions at the end, which at least if nobody else has got other better questions, you might come to. So, I mean, I think you're very frank, there's going to be extra costs. There are extra costs. And one of the really big costs has been uncertainty. and find it quite difficult to put precise numbers on that, but one just cannot avoid the conclusion that actually the 7 years, the 8 years, give it a run up, have really just generated massive amounts of uncertainty. I also absolutely agree with you that the effects of Brexit are going to creep up slowly. They're not over. They're going to come along, and they're going to come along in little dribs and drabs that my profession as economists find very, very difficult to detect in the data. But when you stand back and you look at some of these trends now, even, but certainly 5, 10 years in the future, we will certainly see them. I think it's perfectly true, as you say in the book. You didn't say today exactly, but lots of the weaknesses of the British economy are pre-Brexit, British society, British politics, perhaps, and what Brexit has done, in a sense, has exacerbated those. It's really brought them to the fore. So what Brexit is not, as it were, a completely unique and unforeseen event in the sense of creating difficulties for the UK. It's just highlighted the difficulty we have in managing some things. I think that we really find that we have to go back, as you say, to think about fundamental long-term issues. You've listed some of them in the book: planning, education, well, and indeed at the end of the presentation. And growth really needs to take a front seat. Growth doesn't mean GDP at any cost. There's an environment and there's social inclusion and so on. But growth interpreted generally, making something, making the best we can of the whole we're in, just has to be the absolute focus of the system going forward. Part of that, of course, is that we have to accept actually our position as a medium-sized economy in the world. We don't run the world anymore, and we just have not yet, I think, just in my view, managed to get over that and conduct ourselves in a way that is sort of appropriate to that situation. Now, you highlight sort of wishful thinking. There's been an awful lot of cakeism, and we'll come on to the future in a second. We might have thought in the last year that maybe things had improved with the Horizon, the Windsor Framework, and so on. Not perfect, but at least steps in the right direction, and I don't want to deny that. But we have had a week where, in a sense, we've gone back to the old model of not thinking about stuff very much and making lots of bold announcements, reversing some of the net zero or delaying some of the net zero policies. British baccalaureate, HS2 will ban smoking on the kids. And you just think, oh, no, this is the old-fashioned, that we just announce this stuff and perhaps people will forget or perhaps we'll work out how to do it. It does seem to me that, and I think you've said this in the book, Brexit has done permanent damage to our ability to confront issues ourselves and talk sensibly about them. And it does seem to me that that's a really major issue. I had the pleasure to write a little blog for somebody on the 3 worst things I could think about Brexit, and this was one of them. It's just undermined our ability to confront and manage issues. One of the other problems is our reputation, and exactly as you point out, we are doubtful whether it's certainly worth obeying all the treaties and agreements that we make. We'll think about it as we go along. We probably will, but you can't rely on it. And I do think as part of that, exactly as you said in the presentation, there's a very long shadow from Boris Johnson and the Tory right. Talking, actually, I think not only to the EU, but to other people around the world. You've got to sort of show we're not going to slip back into that if ever you are going to get decent agreements. So, I think it's absolutely, my sort of book. I really do endorse it. Let me sort of ask a couple of questions that you may or may not have time to answer. I mean, of all the sort of various smaller things that you suggested that we might do, I mean, would you prioritize them? What would be the top three if you had to say? And I do think it's really important to be clear what we are offering Europe. You say that you think there are a number of places where there is mutual advantage, but with all trade issues, there's almost certainly some local producer who doesn't think that opening up the market and making trade easier is a good idea. And I think it's very, very important, the point that you make, that a further 5 years of inaction is not just stopping the clock, it's putting the clock backwards. We just drop out and cement in, as it were, our isolation. In the long term, last question, in the sense the $64,000 question, you identify a number of problems with the way the Brits go about this stuff. I've argued that Brexit has made them a lot worse. How do you actually go about engineering a change in behaviour, a change in practice? You've said you worry that the Labour Party might find it too painful to do much, but I mean, are there any other things that we can do to say, the way we did it in the 19th century and we did it in the 20th century and we still do now actually isn't quite working out with social media, with rapid communications between governments, all sorts of other things, lots of regulation. Maybe we just do need to find a different way of going about our policy making, our politics and policy making. Have you any suggestions about how we might go about doing that? So thank you very much for a great presentation, great book. Back to Vivian, I suppose. She's the boss.
I am indeed. Peter, I suggest have perhaps a quick response to Alan, and then I will start filling in questions from the room.
Thank you, Alan, very much. I think on the it's a really interesting question about what do you go for first. So I think you have to be realistic that mutual recognition of professional qualifications, for example, we know there's a clause of that in CETA, and it took 9 rounds of negotiation in a year to get one deal on architects. And even if you did get a deal on architects, that ain't going to change the price of fish. So I think same with conformity assessment. I don't think you're going to get much on conformity assessment immediately because frankly, European conformity assessment industry have taken a load of beef off the British table, and therefore any decision to soften, as Barnier said, we'll not let the UK be a certification hub of the coast of Europe, right? I don't really see why the EU should bother. We've already acknowledged that we're going to have the CE mark. I just think, don't, and this is where I'm slightly worried, sometimes the Labour thinking is quite muddy on this stuff. So I think you need to put stuff on the table quickly. Things like a youth mobility scheme. I think that's a way of making a positive case for Europe, and it's also something that a lot of European countries want. So I don't think that's necessarily easy, because I think legally you're still going to have to do it at a bilateral level. But I think you could, talking to people in the Commission, you'd end up with some kind of Commission rubric umbrella over the top about it. There may be people on this call who have sharper idea of the legals, but I have asked around on that, and there is obviously a tension between Commission responsibilities and national responsibilities. But I don't think the EU are going to go off and do bilateral deals on youth mobility. But I do think they want something in that space. Erasmus, again, the Treasury aren't going to like that, but Erasmus is a quick way of showing some leg, right? This is not a small thing, because I think, the Commission is saying you need a separate legal agreement, although there is a line in the TCA that says, that both sides will look at legally linking. And I know you've written a lot about this, but I do think that linking carbon markets would be a serious statement of intent, right? It would it would put some muscle under warm words, which aren't going to do it, right? Because there really is not, and if Starmer has a small majority, I think all of this is going to be difficult, frankly. But there really is fatigue in Europe. And it's not, Starmer might be a nice guy, but just look at the press, right? This has been going on for years, decades. And, the difficulty that UK is going to have is that it's backed itself into a corner, and it's not clear to Europe. Indeed, it's not clear to me that actually UK politics has got itself in a place where it's sort of structurally impossible to fix itself, to do the things that need to be done, whether it's on social care, whether it's on planning, releasing land for investment and development. All those constrictions are functions of a politics that have failed to deliver to people, and in which voters have frankly lost confidence. And one of the kind of really awful things about the Boris Johnson cycle is it's absolutely deepened people's lack of trust that politics can deliver. And in a world where politics can't deliver real change, what you end up with is just a world of narrative politics. And I think that narrative is fundamentally, go it alone, Britain, anti-European, will be better on our own 2 feet. And people shouldn't, I think, mistake people's frustration with Brexit, which is partly a frustration with the economy, with a desire to suddenly go racing back into the arms of Europe. Because I'm just not sure that's in our political DNA. And therefore, a Labour government is going to have to make some arguments, which current politicians are not very good at. They talk to their gurus and their focus groups, and they tell people what they want to hear. And Keir Starmer is not a particularly visionary and persuasive politician. He's going to find himself in a very fiscally constrained environment, unable to fix a lot of the things that need fixing. And therefore, a big fight on Europe, which yields fairly small economic dividends, you can see a world where quite quickly his advisors are going, Prime Minister, this is not a fight you want to pick. Even now, the Lib Dems at this conference, who are the, one really openly pro-European party, it's a fight they don't want to pick. And then, going back to the point I was making when I spoke in the beginning, there's no desire to have linkage, between how Brexit is attritionally, producing extra headwinds to fixing the UK's economic situation. There's no pitch rolling. So, the more I think about it, the gloomier I get, really, even though I cling to the strong belief that the alternative is worse. And therefore, people who move things and make things and advocate for fact-based policy like the CITP mustn't give up making the case for, sensible self-serving things like linking carbon markets. It's really important that the thing fight goes on. Your last question.
Peter,
yeah.
I'm just going to interrupt you there because we have more questions from the audience. And one thing that we pride ourselves in is to finish on time.
Okay.
So I'm just going to, and it might be that they're connected. So we have 7 questions. So I'm going to link them up a bit. So we have 3 questions that are more about UK politics and the election, 2 questions that are more about looking at it from the EU side, and 2 questions that are more about your suggestions on how to deal with things and the type of approach. So the first question from Anil is, and I'm starting with the politics one, is to what extent do you think actually Brexit is going to matter for the next general election? Connected to that, we've got Charlotte's question around, is Labour basically only cautious now as an electoral ploy, but may become much more, motivated to change things once, if they are elected with a decent majority? On the other hand, Mathieu is suggesting perhaps that the only way you would get that kind of ambition would be with a Labour-Lib Dem coalition. Do you see that kind of, especially in terms of making the political cost of less alignment, political cost of more alignment, more bearable for Labour if they were in a coalition with Lib Dem. So in terms of where do you see basically the different parties, and where do you see Brexit playing a role or not in the next general election? So that's the first three sets of questions, and I'm open to you.
I think Brexit will be a issue in the next election. Not really. Of course, a load of issues that do have Brexit components, the cost of living crisis, the cost of food, net zero and the management and implementation of net zero, staffing levels in the NHS. Lots of those have Brexit, lines to them. Do I think that any of the major parties, with the possible exception of the Tories running a kind of Brexit betrayal narrative, want to fight on Brexit issues? I don't think they do. I think there is a feeling that, notwithstanding polls showing dissatisfaction with Brexit, that someone said to me the other day, that it was Cynic Harvey, the head of the European movement in the UK, who's a Lib Dem, former Lib Dem MP, and he said, I think we have sort of PTSD from Brexit and from the, chaos. And so insofar as party politics will talk about Brexit, it will talk about Europe, not Brexit. And it will talk about issues that have clear Brexit elements to them without mentioning Brexit, which will frustrate a lot of people. But I think that is probably where the politics is. So that's the first question. The second question, is Labour secretly planning a massive pro-European offensive once it gets into power? I hear this all the time. And I have two responses to that. One is, I'm just not sure what the democratic mandate for that is. If you haven't rolled the pitch, if you haven't won a mandate, if you haven't campaigned or put anything in your manifesto that really speaks to what you're planning to do, and then you go miles further than the slightly kind of cakeist, mushy stuff that Starmer's been saying. And if you look at how he ran a mile last week, the kind of overreaction to the Sky stuff, I think that, well, two things. One is that's bad politics. And when you get into these betrayal narratives, immediately Starmer went to The Hague to talk about immigration numbers, and, it was all about plots. Well, it's hardly a plot. He was on took a press call with him to Ukraine. So, but plot and betrayal. So if you've basically, hid your post-Brexit light under a bushel, as it were, in the campaign, well, you are opening yourself to the betrayal plot narrative. So if that's the plan, it's a bad one in my view. The second corollary of that is that actually some Labour advisors will say to you, look, actually, we're going to go quite deep, we're going to go quite big. I think we can do a load of alignment, sector alignment on the quiet. No one understands the stuff, no one cares. I don't think that is the lived experience of the Brexit debate. It is amazing how being a poodle of Brussels, a rule taker, is deep-seated, bendy bananas, right? All of that. If you think the Tory press are going to let you get away with that, I think you're mad. And so I fear, this is what I fear, there will be quite some ambition from Labour. Some people say, Labour, they don't want it, they want to waste the whole first term. Starmer's going to go big, he's going to go early, he's going to get a load of things done, and then not have the whole first term, waylaid by Brexit. You really don't understand how Europe works if you think you're going to go in there in the first 18 months, win a load of big things and put the whole Brexit thing to bed. You really don't understand how the TCA works, how that ratchet is ongoing pressure, right, for friction in business. And so when I hear that stuff in some Labour circles, I literally find myself banging my head on the table, because I realise they still haven't got it, right? They haven't listened to Professor Winters sufficiently. They haven't internalised, right, the basics. So that's the second question. What was the third question?
The third was whether the Lib Dem coming into a coalition would help on the alignment side.
Yeah, I think a weak Starmer government is much worse. For those people who hope for deep engagement, a weak Starmer government is a much worse thing than a strong one. I don't frankly think the Lib Dems will do a coalition under any circumstances. I mean, never say never. If it was the only way to keep the SNP out, maybe. But given how scalded they were, having just come back from Labour conference, I think the absolute working presumption would be a confidence and supply agreement, and maybe not even that, right? Actually, if you go back to the 70s and, the Liberals and Jeremy Thorpe, someone was explaining to me with great glee how, they extracted a kind of hospital and a ring road for every single vote, So a world where Starmer has to go begging to the Lib Dems for their votes every single time he wants to get a piece of policy over, and the Lib Dems extract, X thing for Y constituency is, but all of that is terrible for certainty and good policy making. But I know is the answer to that question, because I don't think there will be a Lib Lab coalition.
So now to go back to the whole, you don't understand Europe, the question like from the Europeans' perspective here. So the first question for Peter Holmes is about the European Commission not having insisted that the TCA is not going to be majorly changed in 2026, but could be open to other supplementary agreements. So do you see something on the ETS as a likely supplementary agreement? And how do you deal with the fact, again, does the UK have enough friends for such agreement to get ratified by every member state? The other similar question around objectives would be, basically the EU has moved on from Brexit to a much greater extent than we have in the UK. So how can we get the UK to reframe its asks against a background of the war in Ukraine, tensions in the Western Balkans, and to frame our ambition in the way that actually fits the EU's agenda?
I mean, the second of that question, I think I sort of covered in the talk, to be honest. I think, without wanting to overstate it and without getting into the trap of thinking you can trade security and wider neighbourhood engagement for trade concessions. That's not how it works. I do think there is an appetite in Europe, and there would be a welcome in Europe if there was a big Starmer majority, a stable Labour government that looked like it was, in good shape to get 2 terms. There is fundamentally in Europe a desire to put Brexit to bed, to create, and you hear people talking about, well, Ukraine accession is going to require, different levels of membership, etc. Back to the concentric circles, which obviously dates back to Mitterrand's day. It's nothing new in that concentric circles piece. So, in the medium to long term, yes, there may well be different footholds in Europe, but I think it's absolutely right to say we shouldn't overstate, how quickly a British Prime Minister can suddenly change things. But that is not. I think it's easy to look at what's gone before and saying that's the only template for what happens in the future, right? Actually, we don't really know, truthfully, how far you could push the TCA review. We don't really know how much engagement we get from the EU because we've never engaged with them since Brexit. Not really, right? Starmer's got a bit of low-hanging fruit at no cost to the EU, in fact, at some advantage to the EU. I think that the other thing to think about is that, and this goes back to Peter's question about the ETS, is that we are public is used to these kind of knife-edge tunnel crisis negotiations, which we saw over the Windsor Framework, we saw over the no-deal Brexit in 2019. The trouble is those push factors don't exist anymore. There is a deal in place. It perfectly suits the EU. It doesn't perfectly, but no one's falling out of bed worrying about it late night in capitals in Europe. And therefore, whatever the negotiation is, whether it's on the ETS or anything, it will be slower and more iterative than people want and are hoping for.
Okay, I'm again going to cut you here because we have 2 more questions.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So the final one, final one, 3 minutes. We have something from Michael Gassioric, or other co-director, on the approach you suggest looks quite functionalist and with focus on small practical areas. Do you think that's enough, or do we not need this kind of major rethink long term, and that might need a new generation in place? And the other similar question from Sheila Page, that talking about youth mobility, Erasmus, these are being kind of quite London-centric, addressing some of the anti-Brexit issues. But going back to examples that are full in your book of like small exporters, small businesses, what can we actually do about standards? Is there anything we can do about standards? And that's it.
The short answer to the last question is no, right? You can't be half pregnant. So yes, you can make it easier. Yes, alignment helps, but alignment doesn't give you access unless you're prepared to submit to the institutions, to the court, and OLAF, and all the rest of it. I do think you've got to start somewhere. But the answer to that question is no. Let's be clear. If you're not going to rejoin the Single Market and Customs Union, the Labour Party is kidding people if they think that they can get within touching distance of those places and materially remove the frictional disadvantage, right? And I'm sure everybody on this call understands that. One of the things that will happen, I think, is that you will start to get frustration from business with the fact that the Labour Party isn't really getting that, because actually you aren't going to fix those issues. I think you basically, in terms of the first question, you need a mix of macro and micro. You need an really early push that draws a line under the past. You need to find ways to go, this is different now. We don't want a zero sum. We don't want to be a thorn in your side. We don't want to undercut you. We don't want to be, in permanent state of friction. And you have to then start on the incremental stuff, acknowledging that it isn't going to change overnight, but see whether, putting some kind of legal floor under the level playing field, which is a way of, it's a kind of reverse retained EU law bill, opens the door to conversations about the way you run regulation, the way you run alignment, all those stuff that actually we contributed to a lot when we were members of the EU, as a way of building a new post-Brexit reality that isn't based on, Frostian head in the sand sovereignty above all else. And, I don't know how that plays out. It's not going to be an instant fix, but it's going to be better than doing nothing, and that's about the best I can do.
And that's, I think, a fantastic, better than doing nothing place for us to end here. I want to thank again, Peter, for first a fantastic book, and second for coming in to talk to us about it. Alan, for your fantastic questions too. And I want to wish you all a very good day. And I'm sure you have fantastic things to be up to now as well. So bye, everyone.
Thank you.